Hey, Rita.
Hey, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining today's webinar, 5 Questions with Professor Paul Hardart, hosted by the NYU Alumni Association. My name is Rita, and I'm a freshman at NYU's College of Arts and Science. I'm also a member of the Student Alumni Council. On behalf of the NYU Alumni Council and the Student Alumni Council, uh, and the NYU Alumni Association, I want to thank you for joining us today for this special program. So before we begin today's session, please know that all of us at NYU hope you and your family are safe and well in this unprecedented time. In this time of uncertainty, we are so thankful you have chosen to spend some of your time with us to continue learning from the collective knowledge of our NYU community. This session is being recorded. All attendees are muted, but we invite you to type any questions into the Q&A box. We'll leave time for Q&A at the end of this session. So today's session features Professor Paul Hardart, who is a clinical professor of marketing and the director of the Entertainment, Media, and Technology program at NYU's Stern School of Business. Professor Hardart, thank you for joining us. And
Oh,
I'll
thank you.
begin with our first question.
Great.
So, due to COVID-19, most of all big sports and entertainment physical events around the world are canceled, postponed, or being held without audiences. We know this will cause a significant amount of economic pain. In addition to the financial impact, what psychological impact does this experience have on players and fans?
Um, Great question. Again, and I think it's smart to think about the psychological impact, not just, of the self-quarantine on a broader level. Obviously, there's going to be grave economic impacts, but on the psychological impact, if you think, I think the gymnast Simone Biles has basically said how hard it is to culminate. If you're thinking about, if you're training your whole life to culminate in the Olympics, and then that's pushed back an entire year. You have life plans, you have training regimens. It's really challenging to sort of get yourself amped up to that period. Same thing for athletes, same thing people going into the draft. So I think it's going to reverberate for the athletes and also for the fans. I think a lot of people, that is their way of connection and socializing, is whether they're going to sporting events, going to concerts, and a lot of that sort of bleeds into what it is to be human. And I think being human for a lot of us is sharing stories, coming together, and socializing. And I think that's been blocked off. And I think it's led us to sort of evaluate. And the nice thing about technology is technology has sort of helped us find new ways of doing that. So I think the sort of the nice byproduct of this, and I imagine you've experienced, a lot of us have experienced this, is that we're connecting with people we haven't connected with in a long time. And I think, so to me, I encourage students and my family and friends is for some of us, we feel a little powerless of what we can do unless you're a medical professional. So I think even the simple thing of being able to reach out to friends and family and check in on people, I think is a really sort of powerful way, because our lives have all been disrupted, whether you're an athlete, whether you're a fan, and finding new ways of sort of finding that connection. Because I think, and again, I think the thing that's going to sort of be the catalyst for changing this ultimately will be a vaccine. I think a lot of people are going to be hesitant to go back to a large stadium or a concert venue until we're clear that we can all come together again. I hope that makes sense.
Thank you. And what do you predict will be the long-term impact on the sports and entertainment field? Will fewer people attend live events in the future? Will there be a future gap in the release of new TV programs and movies since most production has stopped?
Well, the thing, and again, I have to give a talk again tomorrow about this, and I thought a lot about this, is I think to some degree, what's happening is you sort of think of, there's sort of trends that were happening already. People were cutting the cord, people were going to movie theaters less frequently. And I think what's going on here is almost an accelerant. So trends that were happening are being accelerated. They were going to happen anyway, but I think they're moving faster. local news organizations, maybe going out of business. I think that was a trend that was already in the works. So I think the long-term impact is we're going to maybe move forward on a faster rate than we might have otherwise. There's that Ernest Hemingway quote that, how do you go broke? It's gradually, then all at once. And I think some of these trends were happening gradually and then are going to happen now all at once. So I think the long-term impact obviously is the longer people's habits, again, a lot of sort of consumer behavior is related to habits. And so if our habits are watching entertainment at home on our TVs, we may be less inclined to go to theaters going forward. At the same time, the other end of the spectrum is we might have all this pent up demand of connecting on a human level that there may be sort of a push to go back to concerts. And I think a lot of us pine for things that we took for granted, of going to a restaurant with friends or going to a concert, going to a sporting event. So you may see again, but I think that the driver of that ultimately will be the creation of a vaccine. And so I think it will be a slow build, and you're going to start to see things like esports build up a lot more. So a lot of these trends that were happening, I think, are just simply being accelerated, if that makes sense.
Yeah, thank you. And how do organizations like the International Olympic Community weigh the economic disadvantages of delaying or canceling events with the health and well-being of athletes and fans?
That's a great question, and I think it's the same question that municipalities, local governments, state governments, federal governments have all been trying to weigh. Is what are what's the right balance between economic impact and public health impact? And that's a hard question to take into account, particularly when it's the health of your loved ones. So I think it became kind of obvious for the International Olympic Committee eventually that realized that they had to close and postpone the Olympics. As you may remember, the Tokyo had their marathon, which was about fans. I think that was in early March. So I think it became obvious that we were in the midst of a pandemic and they needed to do that. The economic impact is, if they had totally canceled it, that would have been devastating. As you know, building up to an Olympics, there's hotels that prepare for it, they're building stadiums, there's infrastructure. For NBC, which had the US rights, which accounts for about 50% of the total revenue to the IOC, they have to go back to those same advertisers and brands and renegotiate those deals. So I think ultimately we'll be okay. It'll just be delayed, and they know that they will, for them, they have the benefit of it's a whole year away. Some of these other sporting events that are, whether it's the NBA or Major League Baseball, they're dealing with, it's in the midst of their seasons, and that's going to have a much more sort of profound impact in the near term. The Olympics will still happen, it'll simply be delayed, and you can use debt and other instruments to sort of postpone that. But in some of these other sports, it's going to be a direct impact. And like to your point, when people will be ready to go back, that's uncertain of when people are willing to go back and actually, interact on a social basis at a stadium or a live music event.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
And are there opportunities for those in the sports and entertainment industry at a time like this, when large gatherings are prohibited and people are encouraged to stay home? Can you share an example of a sports or entertainment organization or company that is using this moment as an opportunity?
Great. It's a great question. And again, I think sometimes, as always happens is, and like I was saying at the top, is if you look at this as sort of an accelerant of things that were already happening. So obviously for sports, it's devastating because sports happens, in front of people. So that's going to be a challenging element. If you think of ESPN, they have multiple channels, they're 24 hours. So sort of to fill their time is really challenging. But in that, you're forced to come up with new ways of thinking of content. So they famously they rebroadcast the Masters from last year with a live feed of Tiger Woods describing every shot, which ended up doing fairly well and was fairly compelling television. They also did an ESPN game of horse with athletes, less compelling. But again, you have to admire that they're experimenting. Saturday Night Live did their live Zoom version of their show. So there's ways that people are going to adapt. Musicians are doing online concerts. And so a lot of celebrities too are finding ways of connecting directly with their fans in this time. So there are people adapting. The winners are ultimately going to be some of the winners that already were sort of moving forward. Amazon has done incredibly well. Netflix just had its 52-week high stock price because, and the advantage Netflix has, sort of to your point, is that there's no new production. So any, if you think of this, and I hate using war metaphors, if you think of these, the streaming wars, and all of a sudden there's no new production and there's no new arms development, then in that way, whoever has the most content in some ways has a strategic advantage. Netflix over the years has been spending billions and billions of dollars of creating new content. So they have a stockpile. So you or me, Rita, as we're home, we have a deep library that we can access. Peacock, which is NBC's over-the-top service, is moving up its release date. It's supposed to launch in July 15th. If you have Comcast, you can get it as of yesterday. And then they're trying to move that up faster. So, and then HBO Max is also offered free. So a lot of it's coming back to the idea of habits and getting people to try their content. So the studios, Disney Plus, HBO Max, Netflix, and even Amazon have deep libraries. And so they're in some way an advantage and may accelerate that idea of people spending more time streaming at home, subscribing to services in lieu of maybe going on a transactional basis, going to watch a movie in a theater in the near term.
Thank you. And
Sure, thank you.
Is there anything the sport or entertainment industry could be doing or already is doing to help with the crisis?
Yeah, I think, I think a lot of these big companies have sort of created, because as you pointed out, production has stopped, and that's hurting a lot of artists and also people that worked on productions. Same thing for musicians. When we think of musicians, we oftentimes think of your sort of superstars, but outside of that, most musicians make their money and need to make their money out of live performances. So when some of these large concert venues are closed, or even smaller venues, it really impacts. So a lot of companies have created funds to help these smaller artists and/or people or craft services, et cetera, that work on production. So I think that's one thing. But then on a broader level, like I said before, I think people just trying to connect with other people and doing what you can, whether that's making sandwiches for people or finding ways of connecting, because and that's the one maybe nice thing is, ultimately entertainment is about and sports is bringing people together on a human basis. The Olympics obviously is bringing the world together. And I think maybe the nice sort of ancillary benefit, if there were one of this, is looking at the world trying to solve this health crisis collectively, looking at people trying to bring each other together. I think a lot of, the appeal of things like Netflix, which is there are a lot of shows that are international shows that, may open us up to other cultures in ways that we might not have been open to in the past. So I think those are the nice side elements of this that could be, ultimately a change that's for the better going forward.
Okay, so this will be the 5 questions that we'll ask today. And now I'm going to take 2 to 3 questions from the Q&A box.
Great,
So,
thanks.
From an anonymous attendee, less in-person attendance at sports events for the foreseeable future will lead to lower industry revenues. What do you think the long-term impact on player athletes' salaries will be?
It's a great question, and I think, I think the question sort of leads to the answer. I think, as there is lower revenue, now obviously, the bulk of the revenue for sports are going to be from the broadcast and the media rights. So, and those continue to go up. The interesting dynamic that we're seeing is because people aren't buying products, advertising dollars have gone down. That will likely come up again when the economy turns back on. So it should impact the general player, but I think the superstars are still going to make large amounts of money. We saw that even just in the last draft, and we'll probably see it again in this draft, is that superstars are still going to make a lot of money, but the sort of journeyman players will probably end up making less. And I think that's a very good question. It will impact the player salaries, but not, maybe not as much as we think.
Thank you. And from Jason Wormser, there is a distinct possibility that live sporting events will be closed down through the end of 2020. Do you think college sports would be eliminated at some schools, or we see more bankruptcies in pro sports like we saw this week with the XFL?
Great question. Well, first of all, college sports, most college sports are not profitable for universities. So you may see, I think you will see that impact on a lot of colleges, particularly on some of their sports that are, less well known or have a smaller following. Again, the media rights are oftentimes the thing that is the valuable element of particularly, college football and college basketball. In terms of leagues, it's a very good question. I think certainly some of these smaller leagues, the XFL being one of them, the XFL had been doing well with ratings at the beginning of the season and have by around the 5th game of this year. So like we talked about at the beginning, maybe they weren't doing that well, and the pandemic just accelerated that sort of demise that was going to happen with them. So you may see an increase in esports. Again, people are spending more and more time online, and I think that's having an impact on finding new ways of entertaining themselves during this pandemic. So you may see an increase in the realm of esports as well.
Thank you. And from Kathleen Sun, hi. I used to work in the film industry. Cinema used to dominate entertainment in certain ways. What will now dominate entertainment, and can cinema come back at all?
Yeah, well, again, a lot of this comes down to the definition of what cinema is. And this is the interesting thing about this world we live in. Is we used to think of a movie as something you saw in a theater, and TV as something you saw on a TV, the device that hangs on the wall. And now those lines are much blurrier. So cinema, or the creation of film, probably is not going to go anywhere. What we have seen is the puncturing of the windows by Universal, most notably releasing Trolls last weekend directly over the top, so you could stream it. And so you're seeing the sort of traditional theatrical or cinema business, which was a windowing business, that's changing, and that's been changing slowly, but again, it's accelerating in this case. I think people will continue to watch content, but your generation also, I think, is experiencing with shorter content, whether it's TikTok or Instagram or Snapchat, or experimenting with shorter form content. So I think people will continue to watch movies, but most notably, the stuff has to be really compelling and keep your attention. So people will continue to watch movies, and as we saw, what Universal has done is maybe they're going to start to consume it on their phones or in their homes, and only go to the theater for very large, big budget movies that are something that they want to share with their friends.
Thank you. And then I'll take the last question for today. From Melissa Serley. Will the travel entertainment world, i.e. theme parks, look to sports or vice versa for a gradual reopening pre-vaccine?
Can you repeat that question? I'm sorry.
Will the travel entertainment world, i.e. theme parks, look to sports or vice versa for a general reopening?
Good question. I think each one of these organizations, whether it's a theme park, Disney, or sporting teams, I think they're each going to sort of make their separate decision of how to proceed. Some of them are going to, potentially they're talked about having baseball being done not live, but in front of people, and actually going to sort of sequester the players and take their temperature and almost do it in a bubble, literally like a bubble. So I think each one of these is going to figure out the challenge, I think, for a lot of people. So sports could potentially reopen. Like I said, the media rights are the really valuable elements of sports. So if you can watch a baseball game, even if there's no fans in the stadium, that may come back quicker. The challenge for a place, if you imagine going to Disney World or Disneyland, and there's people from all over the world, you have less confidence of who they are. So I think you might see sports coming back quicker. They're desperate to, as you may have read, that the WWE, if you want to call that sports, was considered an essential business in Florida by the governor of Florida. So they can have, because they're saying they're desperate for content. So you might see sports coming back because they can control the environment in which that sports and the players participate. Whereas if you go to a theme park or travel, you're going to have less say or less control over who you're sitting next to on the plane or who's on the Space Mountain ride with you in Disney. If that makes sense.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Hardart, and thank you everyone for joining today's webinar. Thank you, Professor, for your time. And
delightful. Thank you. Very good questions there, Rita. I appreciate your time and so nice. And I hope everybody stays healthy and safe, and hope we see each other all back in person soon.
Thank you.